Well, within the emerging world, and indeed globally, we do have a preference for equities over debt. We do think that government bond yields back up further through the course of next year, and equity valuations to government bonds to us still look reasonably attractive. There's still an ongoing economic expansion, and we should still get some earnings growth globally next year. I think you've got to be specific about which part of Asia we're talking about. In North Asia, so Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, China, where we have external surpluses and where we have very large reserve positions, those countries were not really impacted very much by the first tapering debate in the summer. However, in many countries in South Asia, not including Singapore, but if we look at some other countries in ASEAN where you have external deficits and where reserve coverage levels are lower, that's where you do get into this debate about funding going forward, and where we are seeing upward pressure on government bond yields. Well, we see a 70% likelihood of tapering by March. And tapering, of course, isn't tightening. It will be a very slow process and quite a while before we get monetary policy tightening. But some of that adjustment in bond yields globally is already happening, rising yields. And I think for India that does represent something of a challenge. India has closed its current account deficit somewhat, but it still has got a relatively large external debt burden compared to other countries in the Asian region. And growth is quite slow in India compared to what it used to be in the past. Well, we know from our data that investors are overweight India, as they typically have been. There are some great business models presenting here at this conference, some companies that can do very well in terms of ROE, even in a difficult macro environment, particularly where they're involved in export businesses. I think that issue that we just touched on in relation to tapering does get debated, but it's not of an overwhelming concern. Well, we evaluate all the countries month to month in our quantitative model, so it's the mix of macro risk, valuations, earnings, the technical position of the market, profitability trends. As I mentioned, it's a process that we run on a monthly basis.